Thanks so much. You all blew in on a Kansas gale. Thank you for choosing to be with us tonight for this wonderful program as we welcome John Dole, who is the polling director at Harvard, and he's going to tell us about his book, Fight: How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. And you won't want to miss the opportunity to buy the book and get it signed while John is here. John was here in 2015 and again in 2019. He hosted town halls with our student advisory board members, and some of those folks are in the audience. They can remember that astounding, really once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So we're so pleased that John is back with us. Tonight's interview will be conducted by Senior Associate Director, our own Barbara Ballard. Dr. Ballard has been the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Associate Dean for Student Life, and was Director of the Emily Taylor Women's Resource Center. She's also a Kansas State representative and coordinates the civic engagement programs here at the Dole Institute. Reminder again about the book signing, and join us again in 2 days. We'll have the 2022 Dole Lecture. For the first time in 3 years, we'll be here in person for that lecture, commemorating April 14th, 1945, the day that Senator Dole was wounded on the battlefields in Italy. It's a special day for us. Walt Riker and Clarkson Hine, who were former press secretaries for Senator Dole when he was the Republican leader, will be with us, and they'll have lots of stories to tell about Dole and the media and their experience as well. So please come out to the Dole Institute for that program in a couple of days. Now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Barbara and welcome John Dole. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much. You know, before I start, I would be remiss if I did not say, you know, Jayhawks are all over the country, right here. Right. We wanted to put a little bit up here in flowers to just kind of indicate the Jayhawk colors and everything else and how exciting it is. And actually, when I talked with John had wished me good luck before we played, and we talked again, and he said his wife finished from North Carolina. Am I correct? And I said, well, at least we weren't playing North Carolina, but we did well, and we're extremely proud. So I just wanted us to be present and just know that that's going on. Well, I am so pleased to have John Dole with us this evening. And as Audrey said, he's been here 3 times before. And the most fascinating thing that I can really share with you was that John has the opportunity to talk with young people all over the United States. And I mean, that's a rare job that people have that opportunity to do that. And that becomes extremely important, because how often do you hear people say, we need to make sure that our young people are voting, that they are voting, that they're participating? Well, you know, civic engagement is in the mission statement at the Dole Institute of Politics. And it is there, not by accident, but it is there because we promote civic engagement and public service. That's what Senator Dole lived by. You know, so all of that is extremely important when we bring John here from Harvard. And for those of you who do not know, we are the charter member of the National Campaign for Political and Civic Engagement at Harvard, and we have been since 2003. So I'm going to start with our first question. Tell us a bit about your career in politics and polling research.
Sure. Again, thank you, Barbara and Audrey and everyone for joining us this evening, and for almost 20 years now of collaboration, Barbara, right, between our institutes. As you know, I never pass up an opportunity to come, because my job is really to listen, you know, and to do that effectively, you need to spend time to travel, you know, and so I always look for an opportunity to come here and to spend some time with students. We had a terrific dinner earlier, and I enjoy that. So my career started, I wanted to engage in politics in any way I could as a young person coming out of college. And I suppose that after a few years of working in politics, a pollster identified a skill or a trait that I had and offered me a job to be a public opinion researcher. It was never anything I even really thought about or was interested in, probably intimidated by maybe the math or the statistics, neither of which are necessarily my strong suits. But I think what was recognized perhaps was my ability to synthesize a lot of information into memos or strategic memos in a political environment. Ultimately, that's what we need to do in polling, right? We need to do two or three things well. We need to synthesize a lot of information to get the essence of a question, but that question needs to be something that isn't necessarily theoretical, but something that has context in the everyday lives of individuals. Beyond that, it's particularly important to share a story and to tell the story, and not just to talk about a statistic or a chart or a graph or a percentage. And that's really what I tried to do with this book. Is it's grounded in 21 years or so of research, of very rigorous scientific research, but I try to kind of bring the data alive to show the humanity of a generation or two of young Americans who are much more, have much fuller experiences than, a number or a graph on a page. So it started off in practical politics, had an opportunity 21 years ago to respond to a couple of students who were interested in understanding the values and the opinions, the attitudes of their own generation. And thankfully, we've been at it for the last 42 to 43 semesters, And we mentioned earlier, so fortunate that we have so many students of mine who I'm still friendly with, but two of which are now nationally prominent, and they actually served on my committee at the same time. We talk about bipartisanship, right? The youngest female ever elected to the House before AOC, youngest female Republican elected, a woman named Elise Stefanik. She represents, I think, New York 21. She might be the third ranking member now, I think, in the Republican caucus. And then one of her, wasn't her classmates because I think she was a year younger, is this young man used to call him Peter from South Bend, Indiana, who went home to become Mayor Pete and now serves as Secretary Pete. So he and Elise, but specifically Pete, really influenced the trajectory of the poll and the kinds of questions, because that's what this poll is about. It's not about me asking questions, it's about me channeling the questions and the curiosity of students at this university and so many other places around the country.
All right. So how have the crises and the challenges of the 21st century shaped Gen X?
Well,
Gen Z, I should say.
Yeah. I think, to put Gen Z into perspective, Gen Z represents about 70 million Americans, young Americans, roughly between the ages of, middle school age and mid-20s. I'm not the kind of person who says that you need to be born on this day, of this month, and this year to fit within this generation. Generations are created from a universal experience of a cohort of folks coming together and seeing a series of events. So this group of Americans, the 70 million youngest, the most educated, the most diverse, I think there are 4 or 5 key events in their lives that are shaping their values and how they think about the world. So when you think about this, they don't really have a memory of 9/11. Millennials do, okay? So Gen Zers or Zoomers, I call them, don't really have a memory of 9/11. Their first memory is likely some sort of experience around, growing up in the during and in the aftermath of the recession, Great Recession, right? So the idea of peace and security and feeling secure isn't something that this generation really felt. In fact, a lot of psychologists, development psychologists, will note that even young men to this day still have some of the ramifications of that turbulent time in their while they were growing up. And then they move on to school, where school again should be a place of safety and security. It was really anything but when you think about the rise of school shootings and red alert shooter drills and all the questions around that. By the time many of them are in middle school or high school, they're dealing with things that I don't think my generation X ever dealt with. Opioid abuse, which leads to death. Depression, which led to this significant increase, 200% increase in youth suicide from the first part to the second part of that decade, just as Zoomers were turning 15 or 16 years old, we saw a significant spike in every single state in America. And then you have this just like the whiplash in our politics, from one side to the other side, concerns about information and misinformation, disinformation, concerns about climate change, all this before COVID, all this before the eldest member of this generation turned 25 years old. So what I argue is that while every generation deals with its own trauma and chaos and growing pains, I don't think any generation since, I thought a lot about the greatest generation being here, I don't think any generation since the greatest generation has dealt with more trauma, more chaos, more quickly, in a shorter period of time than this generation, at a time when they don't remember America at our best, okay? Baby boomers had trauma in the 60s, but they had Woodstock and the moon landing, we came together, okay? Gen X, we came together, watching hockey when we beat the Russians in Lake Placid, or after the Challenger disaster, et cetera. This generation hasn't had an opportunity to see America at its best. Been a lot of trauma, a lot of chaos, but I think the good news is, rather than like leaning away and kind of giving up, they've done the opposite, right? They said, we haven't seen it at its best, so we're going to make it. We're going to do what we can at this early age to make America, the country that we know it can be. And they're incredibly active when it comes to virtually all forms of civic engagement.
You're a polling director. So polling has been met with a lot of scrutiny in recent years. What do you see as the role of polling in political strategy and potential limitations?
That's an excellent question, and I think of poll like the good news and the bad news. Like when I started this project, when students started this project 21 years ago, there was very little talk or interest on our campus for public opinion research or polling. There was no conversation at all in 2000 around analytics and big data and those sorts of things, right? And now it's become part of pop culture, right? And we have aggregators and Nate Silver, but I think so much of that part of the field focuses on the wrong things, right? Like Nate Silver judges pollsters based upon are they within 1 point or 2 points of calling an election, right? That's a very different, I think it's a very different field, frankly, than what I consider my job to be, right? Yes, we have to be accurate. Yes, we need to know, what, we need to understand, who we think is going to win or lose an election, who the undecided voters are, et cetera. But far beyond that, we need to understand why people think the way they do, what they value, and how that translates, how that public opinion translates into making choices around policy or candidates. So I think we have far too much emphasis on this, quote, horse race, and not nearly enough of understanding kind of the motivations, right? And I start every focus group. I do, a lot of them on Zoom these days, which is, it's an opportunity to listen. And I think if we did more listening, across the various communities within our country, we'd all be better off. And when the polls, by the way, are wrong, of which they're more accurate today than they have been in the recent past, honestly. But when they're wrong, typically they miss these cohorts of individuals who are kind of disconnected from politics, right? In 2016, it was the Rust Belt, white, working class, older voter, right? Or it could be, Hispanic, Latino folks from the Rio Grande that we don't quite understand, right? Or the differences between, certain groups in Florida of different kind of Hispanic, Latino descents, or of course, younger people, right? So the more time we spend inside these communities, having town halls, having conversations, the better questions we can ask and the better context we can put into the polling averages and the aggregators and those sorts of things.
So how does working with students influence your view of the issues discussed in your book?
I don't know where I'd be, right, without these students, because it's every semester they come, right? It's a new group, mostly a new group. We have some ones who are part of the group on a multiple semesters, but every semester they're coming with this new energy with new questions. For example, Pete Buttigieg, back in 2003, 2004, was just uncomfortable with the traditional two-party labels, right? And the ideology, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. He says, I just don't think, members of our generation think like that, and there has to be, I remember these conversations quite clearly, there has to be another way to look at this. It has to be something beyond this traditional left-right axis, and we worked and we worked and we worked, and we identified another axis, right? We identified through a series of questions we continue to ask this day, basically kind of this other dynamic. Well, about half of younger people can fit, and I think this applies now to other Americans beyond younger folks, can fit on this traditional X, Y, left or right. But there's this other axis where religion and religiosity is the predictor. And so now that explains basically the other half of the electorate. And we have this group that we call the religious center and the secular center. And this is held for the last 20 or so years, right? And when you think about this religious center, it is, I think, the most interesting group in politics. It is the most diverse. You have a significant number of, it's the most diverse of the four groups that we think about, more diverse than traditional liberals and traditional conservatives. You have a lot of Hispanic, Latino, African American folks in that cohort. They think about culture and they come up through church and religion. And on some issues, they are to the left of even traditional liberals, right? When it comes to protecting the environment, when it comes to providing health care, serving the poor. On other issues, they're going to be a little bit more to the right than the traditional liberals or traditional Democrats on some social issues. So there's a lot of kind of complexity and nuance that without spending the time talking to people and understanding where they're comfortable, where they're uncomfortable, we couldn't necessarily discern that group, right, and give voice, therefore, to that group, right, and not put all young people in the same bucket, based upon what they look like or what their age is, et cetera. And the secular center, by the way, and that's where I think that's where a lot of the libertarian streak comes from, So that's kind of one example of their interest. Without younger people, I'm not sure I would have asked questions so early about capitalism and socialism and democratic socialism, this semester. And that was groundbreaking. I'm not sure I would have asked, we spent a lot of time out talking and thinking about mental health. That came from spending time with younger people. And then this semester, it's probably long overdue, but the poll that we'll release, we talked about on April 25th, has a significant series of questions on identity. And I was first thinking about identity at one of our national campaign events, Barbara, when I would ask younger people, you're going to vote, in a couple of weeks, we'd do this in the fall. I said, what identity are you taking to the ballot box? A dad, a Democrat, a Republican, a white male of a certain age with salt and pepper hair, something we talked about. Right. So what's your identity? And I was struck by so many younger people saying, I'm voting for my great-grandmother who never had the right to vote. Right? I'm voting for the refugee who just came here from some other country and doesn't have the right to vote. I'm voting for whoever to protect them. So I found that the complexity of the individual in terms of how they are approaching politics. These are all questions that a lot of my colleagues, in my business, probably don't ask a lot about because they don't have the gift of spending so much time with young people like I do.
Well, tell me more about Gen Zs. What do they believe in? What's their political stance? What is it they can't stand? What are the things that they really like that they're willing to go to mat for?
Yeah. I love talking about Gen Z. You know, can I tell you real quick, like I think there are 5 things you need to know about Gen Z, real quick, okay? The first thing is, this thing was written off as a complete failure, okay? This event back in 2011 was called Occupy Wall Street, okay? A decade later, Occupy Wall Street has had a profound effect on this generation. And one thing they don't like is inequality, okay? And in every shape and form. So think about this. A decade ago, the oldest Gen Z was 8th, 9th, 10th grade, thinking about politics for the first time. And they're thinking about through this lens of, why does it take me 4 years to earn enough money for 1 year of college when literally my parents could have done it in one summer working a minimum wage job? Why? Okay? Why does, after the recession, why does the top 10% have, better a lifestyle today than they did before, and my family doesn't, right? Why do 80% of my friends and their families lost 20% of the wealth? Okay, so one thing they don't like is inequality, and that's how they view politics through that lens. Democrats and Republicans, by the way, through this lens of they're not socialist, they question, the capitalism. That's one. The second thing, whether you're Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter. What motivates some people to vote is when they can see a tangible difference. Donald Trump was nothing if not, a great example of the tangible difference between his presidency and what a Hillary Clinton presidency would look like, whichever side of the fence you're on. The Republican tax, he reduced, taxes. If you're a Democrat, he pulled out the Paris Accords. So very, very clearly difference. That is what something motivates people to vote when they can see the difference. Okay. The next thing, again, what they don't like being fearful all the time, right? And the school shootings, and that was something that had been weighing on them already. And then Parkland happened. And what Parkland did was it lit the spark where they felt empowered and part of something bigger than themselves. And what we talked about this a little bit earlier, beyond calling on all of us to register to vote to try to change this, that movement gave voice to younger people who cared about every single issue, right? So I would visit high schools where you have these really shy and introverted young people who wouldn't want to participate in a conversation, but when I asked them if they ever had a difficult conversation, they say, oh yeah, because I had stood up to this bully or to this situation around race, that they confronted it because they felt directly able to use his voice because of what the Parkland kids had done. 2 other quick ones. The Parkland led directly to an influence, because of social media, influenced this 8th grader in Stockholm, Sweden, named Greta Thunberg, who, since she was 9 years old, she could see things that the rest of us couldn't see, literally, like around the environment, right? And it was just like, she could see this and had a hard time conveying how passionate she felt, and very few of her friends and her classmates and her teachers would really pay attention to what she was doing. So she wrote a school essay, she won the contest, nobody paid attention. She goes, you know what, I'm gonna do what those Parkland kids did. I'm gonna do a school strike, right? Couple days later, it took a while to get going. Fast forward a few months, and she's meeting with the Pope, and Putin, is calling her naive, and she's changing the way in which I think we think about climate. And then the 5th and final thing, and by the way, there's a through line here, I think, and the 5th and final element of what they don't like, again, inequality is or systemic challenges around systemic racism. And if not for this Zoomer named Darnella Frazier, who was 17 years old on Memorial Day 2020, she had just finished a bonfire party with some of her high school friends. And she promised her little 9-year-old cousin that she would take her for dessert. We're gonna have dessert after this, Barbara. Well, she promised to take her for dessert. She takes her for dessert. And she, on the way out of Cup Foods, she sees, a man being murdered. And she took out her cell phone and she recorded it. And people told her to put the phone down. They held their weapons. They pulled the mace out. She didn't do it. A crowd started. And she was the person who videotaped George Floyd's murder, went back to her apartment, while the police were still there, you could still see the lights when she was filming this video. And she just shared this experience of what it was like to see a man die with her 9-year-old cousin, who said, 9-year-old said, "That's my first murder." Right? Like you can count, right? When you're that community, we saw our first murder. And I don't know if we know George Floyd's name without that 17-year-old Zoomer, right? Because I started to do the research around this book. I think there were 9 other men killed at the hands of police that year in Minnesota. I think there were 13 people, men and women, killed at the hands of police the year before, and like 12 before that, right? Mm-hmm. So the point is, what young people don't like is being mistreated, is systemic issues that don't get addressed, to the point where they do real harm and damage. And I think they're stepping out and voting, and they're challenging all of us to do the same thing. Long-winded answer, but I think you get to put this into perspective, I think, in just terms of how these events have shaped their lives in a very, very short amount of time. Before the 25-year-old brain, takes 25 years before the brain, I think, is even like mature, right? So this is what is happening as the neurons are still firing, as they're kind of growing up and dealing with all the other issues that are multiple that I even talk about, right? Around body image and about relationships and social media and all those other things as well, and COVID. So.
Well, as we're moving towards the election, and we're thinking about Gen Z. But then I think we have to move into millennials a little bit too, because they're pretty close to each other. So if Gen Z is more like in their 20s, millennials are going to like their 30s, okay? And you and I talked about they will, because of what they believe, combine.
Yes.
And tell me what impact that has.
So we have now, we think about this country, okay, as a divided nation, 50-50. It is, okay? In 2000, it was also divided 50-50, right? We know that, right, when you look at politics, okay, in terms of Bush v. Gore. But in 2000, we had racial divides, we had education divides, we had gender divides. But there was no age divide. There was no generation divide. A 65-year-old and a 25-year-old both voted the same way in that campaign. In fact, the 65-year-old was a couple points more likely to be Democrat than the younger person in 2000. Okay? In this last presidential campaign, in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the 5 states that flipped from red to blue, delivered the presidency, Donald Trump won the votes of everybody over the age of 40. He won, everybody over the age of 40, he won those votes. He won, Biden won the 30-year-old vote by about 10 points. And he won the under 30 vote by 20 points. It's pretty similar across each of those states. So we think about this 50-50, it's really like a 2/3, 1/3, okay? So 2/3 of people under 40 tend to think and vote one particular way. 2/3 of folks, late 50s or 60s, tend to vote another kind of way. And it's kind of my generation, Gen Xers, who came of age in the 70s and the 80s, are literally like the 50-50 thing. We're pretty much 55, 45, 45, 55. So that's, think about that, right? So every single year, by the way, 2/3 would be more conservative, older. So every single year, you have older members of the electorate aging out of the electorate, being replaced by younger, more progressive, more active folks. Okay, so that's been happening for like 20 years. And I used to say for a Republican to win the White House on a national basis, they don't need to even win the youth vote, the millennial vote. They just need to mitigate their loss. They just need to keep that loss, keep the Democrat from not reaching 60 points, keep it in the mid-50s. And George Bush did that really well, and Donald Trump did that well with the help of a third party. Hillary got 55%, John Kerry got 55%. But it's at the point now where the millennial and the Gen Zers together, they represent 40% of the next election's votes. 40%. Right? So now what we're seeing is we're going to have to reset, I think, the way, in the next election, in terms of Republicans are going to have to compete in a significant way for this vote, not just, like take for granted that they aren't going to vote, they're going to vote all Democrat, because they're very, very quickly becoming a major force. There's very little daylight in terms of the issues that these two generations kind of care about. Very little daylight there. They generally care about the same things.
So what kind of, what characteristics would Gen Z be looking for, ideally, in a candidate?
I like the way in which you phrased that question, because you didn't say what issues or what policies, you said what characteristics, okay? And too often we think about what policies or what transactions, what do I need to give somebody, okay? It's not about that, right? It's about how to align, right? Like the values of whoever the candidate is with the values of this generation, okay? So, Joe Biden, didn't really do particularly well at all with younger people in the primary. Well, by the end of the election, he turned out the highest number of young people who've ever voted before, ever, including when Obama ran, and 60% of them voted for Biden. Second only to Obama's 2008. So what was it about Biden? And what it was that they want to feel empowered. And he spoke to the Bernie Sanders folks on St. Patrick's Day of 2020 when the campaign was coming to an end. And he said, listen, I hear you, Sanders supporters, and I know what you've been fighting for. You've been fighting for access to health care. You've been fighting for a clean environment, and some other issues, okay? And the point was that if the goal and the vision and the values are aligned in terms of where the end result is, a more fair, system, then younger people aren't really necessarily stuck on the details to get there, okay? You don't need to be for every aspect of the Green New Deal. You don't need to be for, a democratic socialist agenda. You don't need to be for what many would consider the more radical elements of the Democratic Party to win their vote, as long as you can see a common set of of values. The other thing that I think really resonated between younger people and Biden was that work ethic, right? When they realized that, because they didn't know who he was, they didn't really have much of even a memory of him when he was vice president, right? But the idea of learning how he grew up, in a working class environment, that mattered a lot too, because people, everyone has their own struggle, and they felt that he, growing up, could kind of relate to that struggle as well. So the point of the question is, what are the attributes, what are the values that need to be aligned, not necessarily what's the right policy, right? What do we care about? What are we fighting for? So I think generally those are the things. The other thing that we're finding in our research, whether you're Republicans or Democrats, is this concern about individual rights and freedoms, right? So finding folks who understand and will protect the rights and freedoms that people from both the left and the right feel are under attack.
Your book is absolutely fascinating. And I think part of it is because of what you're really looking at in so many ways. But what surprised you about your own book?
Couple things. I think one thing, and probably the thing that surprised me, the thing that surprised me that really, I think was a catalyst for me writing the book was, as I said, Harvard, we do 2 polls a semester. At the end of every spring semester, I've got some time away from campus, and I often spend that time traveling the country and talking to people, okay? And I've been doing that pretty much asked the same questions, the same way, with the same cohort of people for 15 years. And it wasn't until 2017, 2018 that those answers were very different. I'd say, what is it that kind of you think connects us as Americans? What keeps you up at night? What do you care about? These sorts of things. And rather than hearing opportunity and the ability to work for something, even if it took someone, 5 steps to go where other people could go 1 or 2 steps, there was still some sense of optimism among millennials. When this generation was coming of age, I'd ask those same questions. I heard fear. What connects us as Americans? Fear. Fear of what? Fear of everything, right? Fear for my future children, fear for the environment, fear for me being shot, when I walk into a classroom, fear for, losing our house because my dad sold his car, then he sold his drum kit, then he sold his motorcycle because he can't get any more hours at the UPS plant. Just constant fear. And I said, same time period, I said, what don't you think people like me understand? And they said, the way you think about paying taxes and your bills. She goes, this is a woman from Ohio. This is the way we think about living and dying every time we walk into a room like this, right? Auditorium, where's the door, where are the exits, who's coming in, what's in the bag. That's the way that carries, that's the weight that they carry. So that was one thing that I had never heard about, experienced. I started asking African Americans, anyone here know anyone who's ever been shot? Every hand goes up. Every single hand goes up. What do you mean? Oh yeah, my 15-year-old brother, my blah 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 blah. What else bothers you? My best friend is in ICU because she took something she thought was something else. It was fentanyl, and now she's going to probably die. Okay, so I'm hearing that. Like I had 15, 16 years, Barbara, I hadn't heard that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. 2017, 2018, that's happening, and then at the same time, as these things are happening through our culture, right? The politics is kind of hard. Like, are we going to go to war with North Korea? What does that look like, right? And why do I get all these alerts on my phone about this, that, and the other thing? And it was so heavy, and that was leading into Parkland. So that was something that saddened me and surprised me. But the other thing that really surprised me, and it is that, as I said, we had this historic turnout in 2018. Election as well. In the 2020 primary, Democratic primary, I was expecting record turnout and all this enthusiasm for all these Democrats. Didn't happen. There was higher turnout than before in Iowa. That was the only state. Everywhere else it was flat or down. So that really surprised me. And I talk a little bit about that in the book, and the lesson is you can never take youth participation for granted. I think Warren and Sanders and Buttigieg in Iowa, they were all out organizing younger people, but limited resources in those other states. Different campaigns had their own strategy, and they really didn't target younger people. And younger people said, you know what? It's a complicated field. I don't see a lot of differences between everybody. I'll just kind of wait it out, and we'll see what happens in the summer and the fall. We'll participate then. So that did surprise me, and that's still a warning, right? Even this year, that you can never take this group of people for granted, because every year it's a new group of younger people coming in. So those were some of the things that surprised me.
So you're a poller, and you do the polls, but sometimes people look at the polls and say, man, those polls were wrong. They were off.
Right.
And someone said, no, they were right on, you know. So how do you make that determination when you look at it? Is that how it's going to be? Not so much by numbers, but who's going to be winning on what point?
Yeah. It's like, I guess it's like everything else. I mean, the more you have to, the more you do it, obviously you get more confident, and you can see like these little things that seem to that seem to track. So one of the things we do now, we've always at Harvard, we've always done very large surveys, 2,000, 3,000 people at a time. When I do national polls now, I do 5,000, 6,000. Most people in my field do 600, 800, 1,000 on one state. And that, I'm very fortunate, by the way, that I have the ability, right, to do these large samples. But when you're able to do these large samples, right, I don't just talk about younger people as a group. If I was pulling the Virginia race, or Kansas, there'll be 100 people in the survey, if I'm lucky, right, who are under 30, or maybe 150, who are under 35. And you can't, margin of error for 100 people is 10 points. So that means I can't make even a generalization about male versus female, forgetting about Democrat versus, so it's very, very limited. Okay, so with the ability to do these large samples, now that the internet, if you do it well, allows you to do, you can get real in-depth understanding, not just of the parties, but of the individuals within these groups, right? And within them, you can see what things kind of are tracking, and whether or not all of those little pieces together add up, to what the number is in terms of who people are going to be voting for. I'll give you a couple of recent examples that really surprised me and kind of encouraged me. I do a lot of work outside of Harvard on public education. Right? I know there's a public education debate, I think, in Lawrence. I can see from just some of the posters and the signs.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Well, on some of these issues, you'd be surprised, right? So, for example, I'll give you two issues. School choice, okay? That's typically kind of a right of center issue, you think, right? It's like typically something, that Republicans are more comfortable with than Democrats, okay? I've noticed for a long time in the Harvard polling that was one area where millennials and Zoomers, Gen Zers, were thought very differently than their elders, okay? They were more supportive of school choice in the Harvard surveys, okay? So today, when I do a poll and ask a question about school choice, there is virtually no difference between a younger Democrat and a younger Republican on that issue. But there is a 30-point difference between a younger Democrat and an older Democrat on that issue, right? So same thing with teacher unions. When you think about teacher unions, okay, this is just an example, right? There are other examples in healthcare as well. On teacher unions, as an example, you think that people who are Democrats can be much more supportive of teacher unions than Republicans, okay? Well, younger Republicans don't really have anything negative to say about teacher unions, honestly, right? But again, there is a 45-point difference between a younger Republican and an older Republican on their views of teacher unions, okay? I don't have the ability to understand that or see that unless I can do a survey that has hundreds and hundreds of younger people, so I can see younger Democrats and younger Republicans on those kinds of issues. And unless we do that, there's a lot of commonality there. You can have a conversation now, right, about that because there's views are aligned. Same thing with some of the issues around capitalism or healthcare as well. And by the way, those people can vote for Biden and Trump. They completely disagree on who they're going to vote for, but on some of those issues, they are much more aligned than we might otherwise expect.
All right. I'm about to ask for your questions now, but your last section in your book is called To the Future.
Yeah.
And he has 10 different sections here, and it can go, the purpose of work will change. There will be plenty of jobs for Americans who have a solid education footing. A federalized Job Corps with basic income guarantees will support displaced industries and reward essential family and community service. America will undergo a rural and urban agricultural renaissance. Generation Z will lead a resurgence of civic participation, and U.S. citizens will be among the most active voters in the world. I'm going to stop right there. Tell me about that one.
Well, we're seeing, Barbara, you know that voting is a habit, okay? And young people in this room voting at twice the rate at everybody else in this room ever voted when they were young. When baby boomers were in your teens and 20s or 20s, based upon where you're on the baby boomers, right? You voted at half the rate as your grandkids or Gen Z. Same thing with my generation, same thing with millennials. So voting is a habit, and when you come of age and you're breaking 2 election records in a row, I think that's only going to continue, and I think they will fight to make the changes, to make access to the ballot, et cetera, that much more accessible to people, and that's a good thing.
Okay. I can give you one more by just looking at them, but when we're going through, Gen Zers will ensure we have the necessary democratic reforms and sweeping civic and social infrastructure investments. We will ultimately face an intense global Cold War against a militant, nationalistic China intent on breaking democracy. You know, so we go through and we look at it, and success and the American dream will be defined by the bonds you make, not the stuff you buy.
You know, one of my favorite questions is to ask young people to describe their best life. Best life today, I get nervous when I see students who could actually check whether I'm right or wrong, like in the front row here. So let me know. But I asked, I said, like, graduate college, like, what's your best life, right? What do you want to do? And often, regardless of where I am, people say a couple things like, I want to be able to, like, live in my hometown and be able to afford a place without, see you're nodding, thank you, without literally going to the back pages of the internet to find 4 roommates, just to live where I want to live and do what I want to do.
I see a lot of people
right?
nodding their
Shaking
heads
hands,
there.
right? And then they'll say, maybe have a few dollars left over for therapy. Okay? Do I hear that like coast to coast? Right? And then
Boy, somebody must have really heard him.
striking a chord, that's good.
Striking
That's good.
a chord.
See?
And the last one, it says Republican effort to tighten voting procedures in the name of preventing voter fraud will alienate Zoomers even more.
Yeah, I think, all right, that's where I thought, right. So you have to be, like, it was easy for both Democrats as well as Republicans to write off younger people as somebody you need to pay attention to. Democrats said they can always turn out for us. We need to work it. Republicans saying, well, they're going to always turn out for Democrats, who really, doesn't really matter. But, the math doesn't work anymore, unless both parties listen and truly begin to engage. The benefit of the access, right, that our students are afforded is that we see, a lot of fellows, a lot of speakers, a lot of candidates for president coming through our institute, and we can brief them and talk with them about these issues. I used to do a lot of that, 2004, 2008, as I recall. I haven't done a lot of it lately with Republicans. I just don't think that they are as engaged as they should be. And I just gave, one issue around school choice, right, as a place to begin that sort of relationship. So, yeah, unless they, my point is, unless they engage in a significant way, it's going to be tough to win national elections, without winning millennials or Gen Zers.
All right. We're going to questions now. The last thing I'll just say here, that every 4 years, millions of young Americans are welcomed into a debate about their future. And most people think about the presidential, that's where they're going to focus, but there's so many other local elections as well that we need to keep in mind, okay? Any questions you might have, just raise your hand, and I have 2 people with the mic will come to you.
Hi, it was a pleasure to have dinner with you this evening. My name is Noah. I'm with the SAB here at the Dole Institute.
An education major.
That is correct. So I appreciate you talking about education polls. My question is, you spend a lot of time with public opinion, kind of trying to focus on what's going to matter to people. What do you think we should pay more attention to as a citizenry that we're not paying attention to? And how does your polls kind of support that this is the issue that matters, that no one's kind of awake to notice?
That's an excellent question. So I think it's a challenge one of the things I find in the last couple of years, Noah, is that all Americans, but specifically younger Americans, are turning away from the news. We talk a lot about the mental health. The ratings and ComScore, they're virtually down, on a regular basis for most outlets and news organizations. And it's not that people don't care about their news, is that it's one way to also basically get some balance, right, and some calm, and not get so anxious and excited, and try to steady, kind of the mental health. So therefore, it's harder to keep an eye on what's happening in Washington, right? The good news is I've been this advocate of like these check-ins, right? That like younger people, especially, this is one of the things you learn, like they always want to check in. How am I doing, in class? How am I doing at work? How am I, like, so I think that like finding the way in which you can check in with the issues and the government that, that you kind of care about is, and making that known, I think is really, really important. So despite that people are like turning away from the news, the State of the Union actually had excellent ratings. It was up a little bit from the last State of the Union, and it was up a lot among younger people, right? So I think that's an example, right? They're not going to be watching every single day, but they'll be doing kind of these check-ins. And I would argue, and what I say to younger people who care and fight for a lot of these issues, or like around climate or gun violence, or mental health or education, that there's so much happening that we don't really kind of appreciate. Like if you take the time to read through, the American Relief Plan, you'll see that there's a lot of money in there for local schools, right? And if you understood that, you can then apply that to what's happening here on a local basis. Where is that money going, and why isn't it being used, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, really look at the things that have been happening, in Congress, because things have been happening, and asking the questions locally in terms of why they're not impacting me locally. That'd be kind of one approach that I might take, because I'm constantly finding that disconnect between actual voters, thinking that they voted, that there's more things that are happening, than they might fully appreciate. Does that make sense?
Okay, I have a question right here.
Thank you for coming tonight. I had a question about your point about Gen Z turning out to vote more frequently going forward. So I think it's a very obvious trend recently that some people turn out to vote for a candidate, but a lot of people are turning out now to vote against candidates. We've seen that on a local, state, national level, especially the past couple cycles. And I was wondering if you thought that going forward there needed to be, or maybe there was going to be, a more loud or flamboyant or controversial political figure or candidate in order to be a catalyst to get Gen Z or other young voters out to vote.
It's a great question, and I don't think it's necessary, because I think all those school shootings, the systemic racism that they see, concerns about immigration, whichever the side you're on. I think those issues are enough, really, to motivate people to vote. I don't see. I'm unique in this, but I don't actually see any decline in the level of participation in these upcoming midterm elections so far, right? So remember, 2018 is when, quote, Trump was on the ballot, right? It was his first defense. He's not on the ballot now, and I don't really see any significant decline in participation. I think the composition could be different, right? I think that Republicans would be a little bit more active than they were in the past, and some Democrat cohorts would be slightly less active. But I just think that it's about fundamental change, and the biggest driver of that is understanding that you can make a difference, and that there's a tangible difference. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. It's a challenge that a lot of folks don't fully appreciate. To motivate, if you're a campaign, you're trying to motivate a younger voter, you need to do two things, not one. What you need to do is, first, you need to build a case that government can actually make a difference, right? The government has made a difference, And you can see yourself being part of that. And then after you make that case, then you need to make the case that whichever candidate you are, that you're the person who can make that change. Older voters, we're used to it. We just go to step 2. Younger people, you need to do step 1 and then step 2. And the difference between lackluster turnout and historic turnout is how well people do step 1.
Other question? Yes.
It sounds like you're seeing these younger generations becoming more engaged in issues and voting increasingly. Are there any signals or tracking that you see where they're running for public office sooner than later in their career?
Anecdotally, yeah. So millennials, millennials didn't really choose to serve in office, right? They did community service. And this was the era of social media and and Silicon Valley and think that they did a lot of work on these issues outside of the traditional system, right? So when you compare baby boomers when they were in their 30s compared to millennials, baby boomers I think had at least there's a number in there. I think at least twice the number of seats in Congress in their 30s than millennials had. Okay, so that's and they're still holding those seats. As we know, right? Okay, right. So now, the oldest Gen Z is like 25, 26, okay? But I don't know, maybe because I'm looking for it now, but I do see some of the organizers from March for Our Lives, for example. Like there's a really interesting, and will be an exciting race to watch, Val Demings, okay, from kind of Orlando, Central Florida. She's running for the Senate, I think, right, for the Senate? Mm-hmm. So the March for Our Lives, like, political director is running for that seat, right, as a 25-year-old in a contested primary. And there are other examples, state senates, mayor, couple members of Congress. So I think that you will see that. It's a little bit hard to kind of quantify now, but yeah. And by the way, and there are also a lot of organizations, too, both on the left as well as the right, who are empowering. There's like a Gen Z. And by the way, in those organizations, they're helping each other, okay? So if you're like, we had them at the Institute of Politics. Like, I don't remember their name. There's like a Gen Z group for conservatives out of Iowa. And they kind of coordinate, actually, in some ways, friendly with the Gen Z group on the left, right? Because ultimately, if they feel like if they can get their generation in here, it's like what we learned from Senator Dole and Senator Kennedy, right? You can have, you can disagree on some policy, but you can still be, friendly and collegial and try to move things forward. I think that's what the hope is for some of these groups.
I'll stay seated because I need a cane like many of my generation, I'm afraid. The press in this country have been reporting polling in Russia, showing that as the war continues, President Putin becomes more popular. Occasionally, the American press, someone will say, well, I know polling is difficult in Russia, but if you read the Le Monde or you read London Times or the Manchester Guardian, particularly the Guardian had a major editorial saying that's a source of real concern to Europeans that Americans are reading this polling information, whatever it is, but nobody knows. Even the Kremlin press office will not indicate how these polls were conducted. The newspapers in Europe are not passing judgment on what its popularity would be. Right. They are passing judgment on the way it's being handled in this country, maybe accidentally.
Yeah, I saw a report. I saw one of those reports yesterday or the day before, and one of them was from a sociologist who's commenting on some focus groups conducted in Moscow. And I made this like offhanded remark, which is, I hope there was both a one-way mirror and bulletproof glass, right? Could you just imagine? right? So, you're right, listen, I've done a lot of polling around the world. And there was, I did polling, my first experience internationally was in Greece in 1993, right? That campaign for prime minister. And back in those days, which is, not long after the military government, you can't ask in a telephone call who you're going to vote for. Okay? You can't say this person or that person. They won't tell you because so many people work for the government and they don't trust people, et cetera. So you ask a series of other questions in terms of what things are that are important, which party you think might do a better job with this, that, and the other thing. So, I don't, believe, right, that anyone is able to do a legitimate poll in Russia on that war. But the explanation I heard from the sociologist was about a couple things, was that the degree of the atrocities were so egregious that Russians didn't believe that their own people could actually do this. And it was their way of coping, okay? So maybe a poll says, like, I don't believe that, but like the sociologist was explaining, that might be a coping mechanism, right? If that were the case, right? And then it had indicated too, right, that and this probably the part of the propaganda that you're talking about the sanctions, people know that they're suffering and that the U.S. is behind these sanctions, and therefore the U.S. is becoming less popular, and therefore the greater scapegoat. So I imagine, right, there's no question that you can manipulate polling, without question that happens here all the time in this country. So clearly, in this effort, it is happening as well, but it's virtually impossible, I think, right, to do that. Not just in Russia, in plenty of other countries as well. Right.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about your opinion on Gen Z and their worldview on America's role in the world, really more broadly. As somebody who's, a millennial, we kind of went through the surge in Iraq and saw, I think that our generation's a little bit jaded in terms of our role abroad and our leadership in democratic society, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to see what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so this is typically one of the more controversial things that I say, which is, that your millennials kind of pass this on to younger people. I said younger Americans do not really abide by the idea of American exceptionalism as much as all older Americans do. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean they hate their country. It doesn't mean that they're socialists. It means what I said it meant, when I started, which is they haven't seen a time when Americans come together and been kind of our best selves, right? And in our surveys, we asked a series of questions on this topic last fall, which we released. All the data is available. You have a significant number of folks who believe our democracy is under significant threat, right? So if you're believing that, then it's hard to believe that, at the same time, I would argue, that in American exceptionalism, right? And they would argue that there are other more younger people would say this in older generations, that there are other countries as great as America, and we're not exceptional, sadly, right? And when I ask them why, what they're talking about, they talk about those events I just shared, right? They talk about the inequality. They talk about, people being, killed at the hands of police, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The difficulties in passing laws in Congress where 90% of Americans agree, but you still can't get it through Congress. So those are the examples that people will give you. It doesn't mean they're not patriotic. It doesn't mean they're not here fighting to make it better. It's just the way in which they talk about kind of the reality that they've grown up with the last 15 or 20 years.
Whoa. I think we can take two more. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, so I was just kind of wondering, are there any, I know that obviously like Gen Z in America is different than like our kind of generation globally, but there's some things like the 2008 Great Recession, COVID, climate change that really affects everyone. So have you been seeing any trends or anything that's pretty consistent across borders and internationally?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Charlie. My first I learned that the hard way about the differences around generations when, like, in 2008, I spent a lot of time in Asia and South Korea. I was in North Korea for a little bit, throughout China, expecting, to see the same, my naivete, expecting to see some of the same characteristics that millennials here were showing. They were completely different, in each of those sorts of places. But Western Europe, I see a lot of similarities, in the UK, in Canada, and the US. We got increasing levels of participation in the UK, and then during Brexit, and then in Canada, and then here. And especially Canada, there's a lot of similarities. In fact, the previous election to our 2020 election, you had younger people voting at close to the same proportion as older Canadians. In this country, 60% of college students voted, on average. Okay, that looks a lot like the average that turnout for all voting age Americans, right? So I do think kind of Western Europe. I want to look more closely, obviously, at the French election. It's a different situation in terms of where the votes from like the Green candidate end up. But a lot of that support was coming from younger people, and there's some indications that Le Pen is doing well, with much better with younger people. And by the way, there's a lot of backlash in this country, right? One of the chapters I talked about, yes, it was pretty scary stuff that I kind of got into here. Some of the most prolific white supremacists, and some of the most violent of the insurrectionists are members of your generation, right? Kids who literally a few years ago were Eagle Scouts, literally Eagle Scouts, writing for the school newspaper about the Diversity Club, were among the organizers a year later of Charlottesville, and now spreading hate across the country in horrible, horrible ways. And the similar things that we saw, with the insurrection and some of these most violent people. So yeah, so there's always that backlash to any of this, especially if so much of the values feel like a connectedness. My generation didn't really have a central. It was, we were never really kind of connected as one. It was always like a 50-50 sort of thing. But when so many people seem to be feeling a certain way, right, there's backlashes that can happen. And sometimes those backlashes can get pretty scary.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. So my question is, how do you see misinformation affecting public opinion, especially across the generations?
I am incredibly concerned about misinformation. I have much more optimism about governments and politics because of your involvement than I do about misinformation in the media. Yeah, so and I don't really know what to do about. I don't really know what to do about it. So there's this tendency for younger people, especially younger people who are, and a lot of the plurality are kind of independent-minded, don't really always vote one way or the other way, who believe in finding their own independent sources. It's like a badge of honor. Like, I have my own independent media, right? And I learned things that I had never learned of before, talking to folks like, these folks, who are very successful. Many of them have a college education. Many of them are married, and doing important things, but they don't trust any of the traditional media sites. They find their own sources, and it's hard to argue otherwise. And let me do a little, we're going to wrap up. Can I do a little quick poll here? Okay. Who here, if you're, not a student, is familiar with the story about Joe Biden and crack pipes? Anybody? Okay. Any students familiar with that story? Raise your hand. Just raise your hand.
What kind of pipes?
Crack pipes. Okay. So I see 2, 3. Okay, 3. So okay.
I know that.
Okay. Right. So the point is, okay, I didn't know about this. Okay, I did a focus group, a couple of focus groups, and almost every single person in both of my groups brought this up organically about Joe Biden and crack pipes. It was like this piece of misinformation and disinformation, et cetera. And people were working their way into, like, I said, why would he be giving crack pipes out? Like, how does this make sense? And people would be like, well, he's doing it for this reason, right? And that's an example of misinformation, right? And then owning it and spreading it, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just one example, right? And that was volunteer. The same group. I said, does anyone have any experience with government this last year? Any experience with government at all? Well, I got my license renewed. Any other experiences with government? Like, anything? Did government ever, like, send you anything? Give you anything? You know, like a $1,400 check? Right? People didn't remember that. It was like the largest government, I think it was like the single largest government spending program like in our history. Targeted all the people I was talking to, among others. They had no recollection, but they could tell you about some crack pipe story, right? So I'm extremely concerned about that, and the ability to see what's true and what's not true, and to debate it, have a conversation about it. I don't know how it gets fixed. Obviously, I think that social media has a responsibility, you know, to address it and to address all the other things of preventing anxiety and mental health, because they have all that data. They know what the detrimental effects are it's having on all of us, you know. So I'm hopeful that your generation can hold them to a better account. But I constantly see it, and it's I'm concerned that could depress. If there's anything that depresses turnout, it could be those kinds of stories, you know, on the left as well as probably on the right. I don't, you know. That could really do significant damage, I think. But thanks for raising it.
Yes, and the last comment I want you to make is, what advice would you give to students looking to get civically involved? That's what we do.
Okay, well, I think not to, like, there are so many ways to get involved in so many different issues, and you can, you know, do it locally. You can do it through an organization. There are so many different ways to get involved. So thankfully, there's more access to those things now, okay? When you do get involved, certainly when you get involved in politics, like I did when I was young, you know, you have an ability, unlike any other profession, where you can have a significant impact at a very early age, right? There are very few professions that allow you that opportunity to make that significant impact and do something that you're going to be proud of, you know, wherever you are, right? So I would certainly could have encouraged that, and the ability to either mentor up and teach me things, you know, about how you use the media and other things. So there's that incredible opportunity. But what I don't want you to do is to stress out about how you need to start doing that all the time right now. Okay, you've already made, as a generation, a significant impact in our country. Significant impact. We do not have, you know, the first African American female justice of the Supreme Court without young people voting in 2018 and 2020. We do not have that, right? We do not have, you know, so many other examples of progress in this country without your participation. So do it at your own pace. I'm confident that you'll continue to do it throughout your lifetimes, whether it's volunteering or working or just ways in which you choose to spend your money and live your life. But you have a lot going on, you know, a lot of opportunities. It's fun to engage in something, but it's also important not to take it so seriously and know that you're already making a bigger difference than you may already appreciate.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind you, just a second, I just want to remind you that we have a program this Thursday, April the 14th, in this very hall, with Walk Riker and Clarkson Hine at 7 p.m. So if you are looking for some place to come, we are it. So that's for the 14th. And I also want to remind you that we do have a book signing in the Darby Gallery in the back John Della Volpe's book, Fight, is, he will sign it for you as well. And I would ask you, how did you choose the title?
I came up with it myself, actually. The editor, the former editor came up with the title, you know, and they got a new editor because of COVID. And this new editor was a much younger editor. And she had not really worked on a book on politics or the sociology before. And she says, I'm thinking something big, like Z. But there was already a book on Z, right? I don't know why. I come from a city called Brockton, Massachusetts, which has a history of boxing and fighting. And I guess that was in like Rocky Marciano, and he's from there. And I was just thinking about that. So I said, I don't know, you're probably not going to like this, but what do you think about Fight? How Gen Z is channeling their fear and passion to save America. And she goes, I love it. So normally, like the editor I think would choose that for you or something, but she changed one word on it. She added, I don't know, passion or something. But yeah, because I think just that's the thing. Like you can. There's so much fear. You can withdraw or you can lean in, right? You can flee or fight. And I think that's what I was thinking of. I was thinking about my hometown. I was thinking about this generation is scrappy. You know, they're just going to fight.
Thank you. Please give him a round of applause for this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate you very much coming this evening, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot. And now if you want, a book in the back of the room. Thank you so much.
Thank you.